Welcome to today's webinar titled Step 4 of the 5-Step Program Improvement Process, presented by Mimi Luskin. My name is Greg Nagy. I'm the Virtual Learning Community Manager from The Ohio State University, who provides technical support for the STEM Equity Pipeline Project. Before we start the presentation, I would like to go over some housekeeping items for this webinar. This webinar is scheduled to last roughly 1 hour and is being recorded in order to view this presentation in its entirety later. The recorded webinar will be available in the next few days on the www.stemequitypipeline.org website. As you've already found out, you'll be watching the presenters present slides through the WebEx interface while listening to them talk over your phone. If you cannot get the WebEx software to work today, you can download today's slides from the homepage of the stemequitypipeline.org website and follow along using your phone. All the attendees' phones have been automatically muted. The presenter will answer questions after the presentation. However, we can take questions at any time. This is how we take questions. At any time during the presentation and during the Q&A, you may submit a question by typing it into the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your WebEx screen. The presenter or I will read and respond to these questions at the end of the presentation. I would like to start the webinar by introducing Mimi Luskin, CEO, National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity Education. Mimi?
Thank you, Greg, and welcome, everyone. Well, we're now ready for Step 4 of the 5-Step Program Improvement Process. I can see a light at the end of the tunnel here eventually. And I'm going to talk with you today about pilot testing and evaluation. Although I will say we have done 2 other webinars that have been fairly specifically targeted towards evaluation, and I'll mention them at the end of our today's presentation to encourage you to go back and review the archived versions of those webinars, because I think they can also be very helpful in informing you of how best to approach moving forward once you've made this big step to implement a solution. But before we get started, let me do a quick review of the STEM Equity Pipeline Project for those of you who might be new to our webinars. This is a project of the National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity that's funded by the National Science Foundation through their Human Resources Directorate. It's specifically an Extension Services grant from their Gender in Science and Engineering program. And the project really has 3 goals. One is to build the capacity of the formal education community, primarily focusing on integrating professional development into existing mechanisms in states who are working with STEM teachers, both career and technical education teachers, as well as teachers who teach the core curriculum. So it's really a professional development project. The second goal is to institutionalize these implemented strategies by connecting the outcomes to existing accountability systems. And in this situation, we have been primarily focusing on connecting our work to the non-traditional measures that are found in Perkins 4. For those of you who are familiar with career and technical education, you may or may not know that every local educational agency that receives federal funds for CTE are required to increase the participation and completion of underrepresented gender students in non-traditional career and technical education programs. In layman's terms and with our emphasis, this basically means students who, women and girls in STEM programs are the area in which we're targeting most of our work in this project. And the third is to broaden the commitment to gender equity in STEM education. We do a lot of outreach activities, and we hope that another outcome of this project is that we'll see more commitment to this kind of work across the states that we're working in. We're doing this primarily through 5 different methods. One is conducting professional development, like this activity today, virtually. And also we're doing face-to-face training in the states. We also do quite a bit of professional development at national conferences across the country. And so maybe some of you have seen us at a variety of places. We do focus teacher training around this 5-step program improvement process in the states that we're working in. And it's 2-day training typically that we do to train trainers to really build their capacity to work with other teachers in their state. We also provide consulting and technical assistance to the states that I'm working with. Of course, we have this virtual web-based professional learning community where it's the stemequitypipeline.org website, which I'll refer to in our presentation today, and I encourage you to go there and take a look at all the resources that are available to you. And the other thing is, lastly, is after the completion of the project, we will develop a best practices, it'll be a web-based handbook, quote unquote, identifying the things that we've learned from the project. So how can you get involved? Right now, there are 7 states involved in the project: California, Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin. If you're from any of those states, I would encourage you to contact the state contacts from those states. If you go to the STEM Equity Pipeline website, under the state teams menu, you can find the contact information for that person to get involved with the activities that are going on there. Certainly, participating in the virtual learning community, either by going to the website or participating in these webinars, is also another way that you can get involved. And just by the fact that you participated today, if your name is not already on the listserv, your name will be added. We send out once a month a compilation of events, activities, resources, news around equity issues in STEM across the country. So we have a poll that we'd like to put out there to start with today to get a sense as to how did you hear about today's webinar. These are the options that the poll will present to you, and you'll notice that some of the options have an indication, a little chat in the red item on the right. What I'd like to ask you to do is, on the right-hand side of your screen, you should have a panel that says chat. And then there's a place where you can see the string of conversations. You'll notice that some of us were conversing earlier about needing to get our phones muted or unmuted, et cetera. But there is a blank box there where you can enter a response. And basically, for example, if it says email from another listserv, if that's the choice that you give on the poll, I'd like to know what listserv it was, just the name of it, name of the organization. If it was an announcement in another newsletter, the name of the newsletter. If it was a presentation at a conference, what conference was it? Something of that sort that gives us a little better indication of how you heard about this webinar. And then in the send to box, I want you to be sure that you can go ahead and have it clicked so it reads all participants. That way everyone can see the string of responses. And Greg, I need the poll put up on the screen. Are you there? There we go. So you can select more than one response. If there are a variety of ways in which you heard about this webinar, please pick all that apply. And then you'll notice at the bottom right-hand corner, there's this little submit button. It's really easy to miss it. And so when you've completed your responses, if you'd hit the submit button, then that will go in. It looks like we've got about 24 seconds left, time elapsed. But remember, if you did select B or D or F or H or J, any of those, if you would go to the chat bar, open the chat bar, and enter in there more specific information about where it is that you heard about the webinar. And the other thing is, if you enter something in the chat bar, it gives me a better sense of that you're all awake out there. Because I have absolutely no idea. You guys could all be snoozing as far as I'm concerned. So if we can get some chatting going on, that would be great, in addition to response to the poll. And again, on my screen, when the polling thing came up, all the other bars closed to just single slices across the right-hand side of my screen. If you click on the chat item, down arrow, you can do that. And Lori, thank you very much. I'm glad to know that you're not sleeping, you're multitasking, and she says hi to everyone. I'm sure you can all see that. Well, let's see what the poll says, and we can go back. And feel free, as we're presenting, if you get to the chat function, to go ahead and enter in there more specifically where it was that you heard about today's webinar. But it looks to me like the largest group of you, 67% of you, actually received a direct email from the listserv. So that's good to know that that's getting out there. Another group here indicated the STEM Equity Pipeline website was a place where you learned about it, so I'm glad to know that people are going there to look. We had a few people who didn't respond. An announcement in the pipeline press, so at least some of you are reading your newsletters. That's great. Looks like a couple of folks had emails from a colleague, and And a presentation at a conference. So the two people who responded to that, if you wouldn't mind letting me know what conference you were at and heard about this, I would really appreciate it, because that also helps us track sort of where information is getting and flowing around to folks. So that would be very useful. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and move on. Again, you can just go to the chat bar anytime and enter information about where you heard about the webinar, if it's something more specific than the items we suggested. And those of you who heard this at a conference, if you can let us know what conference it was, it would be great. All right, so the 5-step process. Here we go. We did step 1. I hope many of you participated in that, talked about documenting performance results and how to look at Perkins data and other data to identify gaps in performance between various student groups. We looked at identifying root causes. What are the barriers that students face, and what does research tell us about those barriers? We then looked at step 3. What are the solutions for impacting the root causes identified in step 2? And what's the best approach to take in order to ameliorate the barriers so that students can be successful in non-traditional programs like STEM-related programs, particularly for women and girls? And so today we're going to move on to step 4. Pilot test and evaluate best solutions. Why do we want to do this? Well, basically, many of you may be thinking, pilot testing, we're just going to implement something. Well, I think it's important to think about how you do that in such a way that your improvement strategy is tested a little bit before you actually go full bore with it. I think the other issue here, too, is from which perspective you're looking at this. If you're a classroom teacher and wanting to implement something in your classroom, that's a fairly small environment in which that implementation is going to occur. Pilot testing is really not a relevant term, a relevant process in that case. But if you're a school administrator or even a teacher who wants to see about how to replicate this with other teachers in your school, you're in a situation where pilot testing makes sense. And certainly on a statewide basis, if any of you are here from state agencies, pilot testing, again, is a very sensible thing to consider before trying to do something system-wide. You want to make sure that the improvement strategy that you're going to apply will work. So the first step in that process is to choose a study design. Now, there are basically 3 ways to do study designs, and the first one is a random assignment with a control group, which is sort of the ideal experimental scientifically based process, which in many ways may not be feasible, but certainly if you're in a situation where you can randomly assign students to an intervention and have a control group of students who are not participating to compare the differences between their response to whatever the intervention is, this certainly is the best way to test something, to be sure that it basically allows you to rule out external factors that might affect student outcomes in this case. But unfortunately, scheduling conflicts, ethical considerations, the need to collect data on all students, particularly in current technical education programs, really makes this approach difficult to employ. But certainly if you're in a situation where you can do that kind of thing, that's great. Option B is probably more relevant and possible, and that is by comparing the population that you're going to be working with similar populations. And it's also really important in this case that when you set this up, that you identify a comparison population in a site that's not receiving services versus your situation. But they need to be students of very similar makeup mix, as similar as possible in order to be sure that the intervention that you're applying in one location is really the reason why something occurs. And for those of you who do education research or know much about education research, you know how this is a slippery slope and difficult to do. Probably more likely people do or the type of pilot testing is basically by comparing individuals against themselves. It's the simplest approach to measure change in performance. And basically the idea is to see whether or not the intervention created any observable change in the students in which you're working. So you're comparing sort of a pre- and post-test process. which is more likely how people might be doing things. So here's a second poll just for some consideration. In your situation, which type of pilot test would you most likely implement? A random assignment with a control group? Are you in a situation where you have the ability to do that kind of pilot testing? Would you possibly be able to compare similar student populations in your school against another site that's not implementing the intervention to see what differences there might be? Or are you more likely to want to do sort of comparing individuals against themselves in a pre-post evaluation process? And the poll is up on the right. If you just pick one, A, B, or C. And I think don't forget to click the submit button down at the bottom right-hand side, and we'll take a look at what the response is. I'm going to talk for just a second while the poll is elapsing over there on the right-hand side a little bit about how to select pilot sites. When you do this, one of the things you want to first of all consider is student characteristics, such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, English language proficiency, special needs status. If you're doing student comparison groups, or if there's a particular, when you did your analysis, for example, back in step 1, and what you saw was a gap in terms of, let's say, low-income students participating in STEM programs, then again you want to be sure that you're going to implement your intervention in a location that has students of that characteristic so that you can test to see if the intervention works with that student group. So responding to the poll, sort of as I suspected, looks like some of you can do comparisons with similar student groups. That's fantastic. And more likely, many of you will be doing comparing individuals against themselves, which is more likely what we might see in many situations. And it looks to me like there's even one person who could do a random assignment setup, so that's fantastic, because as we know, that's the best way to do research. So, all right, so selecting pilot sites, look at student characteristics, look at the site characteristics, the size of the student population, the geographic location. These are the things to keep in mind when you select the site. Performance on the state indicators, if, for example, you're in a situation where you have multiple, let's just say multiple high schools in a school district, and you've disaggregated the data by high school, and you've got sites that are performing better than others, you want to pick to pilot those sites that may be performing at a similar level so you can test the intervention. Post-secondary participation rate, what's going on with transferring students, if one of the things you're trying to test here is whether or not the intervention increases or decreases that activity. The intensity of the coursework, one of the things about pilot sites, especially if you're going to try to do a comparison about whether or not the intervention is similar, is that program mix becomes really important. If you have more intensive course offerings in one location than in another, and you apply the same intervention, it's very difficult to compare the results of those if the intensity of the coursework is different. Organization of instructional delivery, magnet schools versus schools that have a comprehensive curriculum, or schools that are on a block schedule versus schools on a regular schedule. Some of those things you need to keep in mind also when selecting characteristics. If you want to try, if you're going to select multiple sites, you want to try to select sites that are as similar to each other as possible to test the intervention. The other thing you can do is to, if part of your design work is you want to test the intervention in a variety of sites, let's say, keeping that in mind that you might do, if you're in a situation where you have multiple schools or multiple classrooms that you're going to be working on, you need to be careful about comparing those classrooms if you're choosing different characteristics. But you can, maybe you have a group where you're going to want to really focus on low-income students in this situation, and another place where you're going to look at issues related to race, ethnicity, or just the students with disabilities, for example, in STEM, women who are disabled in STEM, and how to implement a program with those student populations. Again, keeping all those things in mind when you're organizing a pilot testing program. Now, remember, you can do this at various layers of this. when I talk about pilot testing and you're looking at district-wide, statewide, you have much more variety in terms of where you might choose to do something. But this can also happen in a school setting itself where you really are looking at program pilot testing. In other words, you know, you have this issue that may be school-wide, but you want to test an intervention in a specific program. If it's whether it's working with a teacher on trying to increase their equity effectiveness in instructional practice, or setting up a mentoring program, or you know, doing some other kind of an intervention awareness activity with students to see if it increases their likelihood to enroll. Those can all be done in fairly program-specific settings and then can be rolled out and replicated in other programs. Remember, though, that there are issues here about the size of enrollment. Again, looking at Perkins performance, the potential for intervention implementation. One of the things that I always mention is that it's really important that you pilot test something at a place where it's likely to have acceptance and work. You know, if one of the things that you find in your root cause research is that there's this issue with instructional design or instructional practice, and so you pick your pilot in the classroom where the teacher has no interest in changing the way in which they teach. I mean, this is the most absurd example, but you know that in that situation, you're more likely to not have the intervention be successful, probably very likely, and you'd be much better off to actually pilot in a situation where you have particularly the human resources that have bought into the concept. Access to resources is also important because, you know, sort of tying back to this idea about strategies, selecting a strategy that you have appropriate resources to support. The same thing applies here. If you're going to try to test it, be sure that you do it in a situation where you have the resources available to test the strategy. So all that being said, whether you're doing a pilot test or you're actually going to implement a strategy because you're in a setting that's too small to really pilot appropriately, there are two types of evaluations that you need to consider. One is what we call a formative evaluation. It really measures the process of implementation. How well is the program being implemented? I like to, the metaphor I like to use, it's the cook tasting the soup. Do I think that what's happening here is good, and how is that going? It's really about the process. It's the recipe part, evaluating the efficacy of the recipe. And the thing that you all need to know is this is the area that most of us get stuck in. You know, how many people showed up at something? How much fun did we have on Saturday? What I would consider to be the process measures. The second type of evaluation that is probably more important, and certainly in this current environment in education has become the focus of accountability, is the summative evaluation. It's the outcome measures. It's did the program produce the desired results? And it's really the guest tasting the soup. Did everyone drink the soup and actually went out and bought more cans of it because they thought it was great, or took your recipe home and actually cooked the same recipe again? So those are the two types of evaluations to keep in mind. And I'm going to focus primarily today on the summative evaluation because it's really the issue where I think more of us need to really focus our work. It's so easy to do a formative evaluation anyway. So here's just a little quiz. What type of evaluation measurement is this objective? 50 women will participate in the mentoring workshop on Saturday, June 15th. Is that a formative evaluation measurement objective or process measurement objective, or is that a summative evaluation? Is it an outcome measure? Would you consider this to be an outcome measure? So you have 50% chance of being wrong, or better way to look at it, 50% chance of being right, and maybe a larger percentage because all of you are so smart. Tell me, is that a process measure or an outcome measure? Based on what I just said before. Again, answer A or B and hit the submit button. We have about 3 seconds and we'll see the response here. Get Greg to load the poll. In a minute. There we go. All right, so looks like we have a little mix of responses here, which is good because that means we need to continue to talk about this for just a minute. Some people said it was a formative evaluation. In other words, it was a process measure, and some people considered it to be an outcome measure. Well, in my estimation, this is a formative measure. It's a process measure. It's about the process of implementing the project. When we talk about outcome measures in terms of a summative evaluation, although the number of people who participate is a really nice thing, it's really not an outcome measure. It's more about the process. It's more about the interest in the activity. It's not a measurement of did the activity create some change in behavior, action, attitude, et cetera. So let's talk a little bit more about these outcome measures, and I think you'll get a clear picture of what I mean. When you're doing a pilot test or you're looking at implementing a solution, it's really important that you select both short-term measures and long-term measures. It's really often many of us who do summative evaluations get so bound up in the long-term stuff that it's really difficult to sort of keep perspective about what's happening on a daily basis or in a shorter term. Because the Perkins measures themselves are long-term measures, they're really looking at effect over significant amounts of time, because we're talking about course enrollment behavior, and then we're talking about completion. And so if you look at the difference between the two of these, short-term measures typically are something that you can measure immediately. In other words, I enroll in an activity, I go to it, and something happened to me at that activity. Not just the fact that I was sitting there and I did 10 hours of seat time, which is, again, that's a process measure, not an outcome measure. What is the short-term objective that you wanted to try to accomplish by actually implementing the activity? Did you want to increase someone's awareness? Did you want to increase their knowledge or their understanding? Did you want to change their attitude about something? Or did you want to actually change their behavior in some short-term way? In other words, they might actually go do something with this after they receive it. So short-term measures are really about the kinds of things that you can see happen immediately and are often tested in a pre-post type of evaluation process. In other words, before the event occurs, you complete a survey of your knowledge of STEM careers, then you go to this event, and then you complete a post-test, and all of a sudden you have become a lot smarter about what the opportunities are out there. That is a short-term measure, and that is definitely an outcome measure, although it's not necessarily the ones that we're being held accountable to under the current environment in education. But they certainly are ways to measure student impact in a more short-term way of the activities that you do, and are, in my estimation, kind of the baby steps in getting to the long-term measure. Because as you know, changes in behavior, first of all, require change in knowledge, attitude, awareness, all of those things. And certainly getting a student to enroll in a program is going to take a series of events to get that to happen, unless they're already prepared and ready. Now, long-term measures are the things that we more often think about, especially when we're looking at accountability measures in education. Enrollment, achievement, whether it's GPA, standardized test scores, et cetera, completion of programs, graduation from high school or college, or a transition from high school to community college, or transition from community college to a baccalaureate program or into employment, et cetera. There are lots of long-term measures that are more standard to the types of measurements that we see in education accountability systems. But the thing to keep in mind is as you develop a way to evaluate the activity that you're doing, it's really important that you also put in place short-term measurement approaches that allow you to understand whether or not you're making progress towards your long-term goals. And those objectives are important. So, writing objectives. I'm sure that many of you have been involved with writing grants before, and this is the stuff we love to do. We have to write objectives. And I'm sure that this little acronym probably rings true to many of you who've done this before. You need to write SMART objectives. And evaluation objectives should be specific, and this is really important, that they have to be specific to the program that you're implementing. Try to be very clear about the type of impact that you want to have happen, and that it's specific to the effort, direct to the effort that you are applying. This is not about changing the world or doing something that's, sort of ethereal. Try to be very specific about what the objective is focusing on. The second part, of course, is that the objective must be measurable. And the way I always test myself on these is typically I want to see it's either going to increase or decrease something. And I usually like to say by how much because that really sets a goal for me. And that's important. At the same time, however, this objective must be achievable. In other words, you don't just sort of pie in the sky it and say, well, we're going to increase our enrollment in STEM programs by 10% in the next 6 months. Well, if you take a look at the history of enrollment in those programs and you've done your documenting performance results from step 1, you should have a trend analysis that will give you a sense about what you can expect. Even in a situation where you haven't put in an intervention, you can expect, what is the achievable result? How many percentage points do you think we really can move forward? And it's important to set your goals high, but I think it's also important to set a goal that's realistic. And so be sure that your evaluation objective is achievable. And use the history that you know. Use the data that you've collected already. If you're writing an evaluation objective that's specific to some analysis you did previously, use that information to help you write an achievable objective. Be sure that your objective is relevant. And what I mean by this is that I think you need to write objectives that the folks who are going to implement your program look at them and go, what? That doesn't sort of fit the mix here. Or they respond with a, so what? I think that that's really important, that you make sure that the relevancy of the objective to the program activities that you're implementing are there. For those of you who are really interested in evaluation, there's something called a program logic model. I'm not going to get into it today, but if that interests you, I would encourage you to do some reading about program logic models, because those really sort of help you build the stream of information in terms of the types of evaluations you're going to do that are relevant to a program implementation. But I think the so what test is a good way to make sure that the objective that you set for yourself is relevant to the work that you're doing, that it holds weight in people's minds, and it is something that you really want to change. And lastly, that the evaluation objective is time limited. Set yourself objectives that say you are going to accomplish something by a certain date. It's really nice to say you're going to do something and never set yourself the date out there, because then you can just keep pushing it off and pushing it off and push it off. But force yourselves to actually say, we're going to accomplish something by a certain date in an effort to try to keep you on track. That's a really important part of good objective writing, too. So here are a couple of objectives I just sort of put together for food for thought for you all. A short-term objective might be, after participating in 80% of the STEM career mentoring activities, that means basically if you offered a series of career mentoring activities, those students who participated at least 80% level would be included in this evaluation measurement. 75% of the participating students will show a 1-point on a 5-point Likert scale increase in their willingness to consider pursuing a non-traditional career. Okay? Fairly simple, very short term. Basically says starting before the activity to the end of the activity, again, having them take this assessment, have they changed their willingness score from a 4 to a 5 or a 3 to a 4 or something like that. And that is the evaluation measurement for you. Long-term might be STEM-related career cluster programs will increase the participation of women by 5% 2 years following the implementation of the mentoring program. So it sets a measurable objective related to the activity that has time limits, a long-term time limit in this case. Again, those are the types of measurements that are usually a little bit more far-reaching. Short-term, you can have a series of short-term evaluation objectives that can help you measure your success. So after you've written your objectives, you now have a set of objectives, short-term ones and long-term ones that are SMART. You need to identify the data sources and collection instruments you're going to use in order to identify how you're doing in terms of those things. Now, again, this is the place to sort of check yourself about, one, am I setting up myself for failure because there's no way I can possibly do all of what I'm suggesting? Be very clear about the outcome measures you're going to set in place and that you can actually implement what the evaluation is going to require in order to be able to test where you're heading. So be sure you have the resources in place to do this, and we'll talk more about that specifically later on. But again, another place, don't write 25,000 objectives because you want to measure every little twist and turn of how things happen in the project, because you can't possibly do all of that and or analyze it. The other thing is, don't write an objective you're not going to actually measure. Not worth putting it on paper. Only put those things out there that you will actually do. So it might be, your data sources might include student transcripts if you're looking at academic achievement, or you're looking at course enrollments, or you're looking at transcript types of information, transition issues, et cetera. Guidance records, if the career guidance process is part of what your strategy has to do with, the level of contacts that maybe a student has with a guidance person. Survey instruments are what we typically use. You know, there's always the good old after the event evaluation. How was the food? Was the room okay? You know, that's all the stuff that can go off of your evaluation now, because those are the things that really are not relevant. Interviewing a core group of students after the process is over, or even doing focus groups, and certainly classroom observations are relevant, especially if you're looking at trying to work on teachers' behavior. So we have a question. When discussing objectives, it makes me wonder if they shouldn't be addressed as part of step 3. Should we know our objectives when looking at possible solutions? Actually, no. And the reason I say this is, don't confuse these with the identification of a root cause. What you want to try to do is, in the root cause process, you're really identifying what barrier it is that you want to impact, and a solution that's going to impact that barrier. And then you need to evaluate whether or not the solution actually creates that impact. It may feel very similar because they are related, but you'll notice I haven't really talked much about root causes. I've almost been tying my conversation back to step 1 in many ways about the data pieces and stuff, because oftentimes those are the measurement tools you'll go back to and use. But still, really, writing objectives has to be fairly specific to the activity that you're going to implement. That doesn't mean that in the process of doing your root cause evaluation that the objectives start to become clear about what it is you're trying to change, but the objectives specific to your implementation will not come clear until you've actually made your solution choice. So, Dan, I hope that addresses what you're asking. Be sure that your data sources and collection instruments are of these 4 things. They're valid. They directly assess what you're trying to measure. You want to measure A, not B. Be sure that your assessment instrument does that. That they will produce repeatable results. Oftentimes, if you're going to use a survey instrument, you may want to pilot test the survey instrument prior to actually implementing it for your evaluation process to make sure that there are no questions about interpretation of questions, et cetera. That it's cost effective. I mentioned that before, the fact that you have resources available to do that, and that they're timely, that the measures are time sensitive to the outcomes, that if you want to know immediate response about an activity, that's when the evaluation or collection instrument is used, that it's not 6 months later when people have sort of lost touch with what happened at the event. or activity. So again, if you're going to do a pilot, whether this is a pilot site implementation or full-blown implementation, and we'll do a Step 5 webinar in a month or so when I'm really going to talk about implementation tools and things to consider when implementing programs. If you're going to do a pilot site implementation, be sure that you train the folks that are going to be involved with the project. Share research with them about the potential outcomes so they understand why the intervention is being implemented. I mean, even going back to, showing them the research that you did in Step 1 around data analysis and what the root cause analysis was, in case you're actually implementing in a situation where the people haven't been involved in that process. I'm not recommending that by any means. It's much better if you have everyone involved all the way through. But sometimes you might be in a circumstance where you select to implement something in a site where not everyone's participated, but they might be involved in the piloting or implementation. Be sure people understand the strategy and how to implement it according to the model that you're applying, if it's a model that you're using. That's why it's so great to find others who have implemented and who have been really good about documenting what they did and then sharing that with you so you can share it as part of a training strategy. Of course, providing technical assistance and support as the program is being implemented. And, some of you may be thinking to yourself, man, this is going to be me talking to myself. Well, yeah. If you're implementing a program, you got to provide yourself with some technical assistance. And that's part of what our project is all about, is if you get involved with something and you need a little assistance, give us a call. I'll just put that out there, especially those of you who are working in states. A phone conversation sometimes can help you get right back on track. Be sure that the evaluation and data collection procedures are implemented through training with staff, that they understand if there's an intake form or some kind of data you want to collect at the beginning, that gets done at the appropriate time. There's nothing worse than implementing a strategy and then all of a sudden saying, oh, we should have done this, or we should have collected this information, or, oh, I forgot the evaluation. I mean, I'm sure some of us can admit that that's happened to us before. So make sure that everybody's aware of the evaluation process that needs to happen. So easy to get really tied up into the strategy and, making sure the invitations get out, or that the students are enrolled, or you've got the buses all there, or the mentors are all set up, or that kind of thing, and then you can lose track of this part really easily. And I hate to say this, but this is probably the most important piece that needs to be done, because it's going to really tell you whether or not all that effort was worth it or not. And do your best to keep it simple. I'm complicating this somewhat to some degree, but take from this what works for you and keep your evaluation process as simple as you can. Now, analyze the initial results when you get going down the line and you've got your program implemented and you've started to collect evaluation results. The first thing is you really need to budget time for evaluation. I'll say it again. You've got to budget time for evaluation. That means money for evaluation and time for evaluation. You can use basic descriptive or summary statistics, very similar to what we did in Step 1 when you collect the data. Charts and graphs that shows the response rates of students is a really good visual to help you understand what it is that you're looking at. Again, disaggregate the data to see if the gains are realized equally amongst all populations if you're working in a broad group, and also to see where you might have great successes with one student group and not with the other, and sort of understanding why that might be. And then determine if you're ready to move to full implementation, because you may not be. You may be in a situation where you want to keep testing this a little bit longer. That's also a possibility. All right, so when you develop proposals for funding a project, or you think about your local Perkins application that gets completed at your school district or your college, how much is there budgeted for evaluation? Nothing? This is a poll, so you're going to get to respond to this. Greg's going to pop this up in a minute. Nothing, is it really the thing that always gets overlooked, or is it, well, we might have a little bit left, so we'll use that for evaluation. Maybe it's 2%, maybe it's 5%, or maybe it's 10%, which is 10% is actually sort of the standard evaluation number. If you're going to evaluate a program, typically 10% of the implementation budget should be focused towards evaluation. Most of you are probably going, whoa. And that's what we do in our program. We have a very large evaluation component because we want to be sure that what we're doing is really having some effect. Or in some cases, do some of you spend or set aside funds in a project more than that? Greg, you want to pop the poll up there? So you have those 6 choices. Please just pick one. Don't forget to hit the submit button down on the right-hand side. And let's see what people actually do when it comes to setting aside funds and time, resources, et cetera, for evaluation. Now, what happens while the poll's being done, let me just say this, and this is the slide, and really, I don't never like to talk about what happens if it doesn't work, because sometimes it does work. Excuse me, sometimes things don't work, and hopefully most of the time they do. But, again, I want you to think, if something isn't working, is it something that's happened in the process previous? Did you identify the root cause correctly for the performance problem that you were seeing? Did you really select the best solution? Was there a match between those things? Did you correctly implement the strategy based on the way in which it should have been completed? Was there some issues that something got missed? Or basically, have you just not given it enough time and you're assessing your results way too quickly? So let's see. We have a few people who responded here. It looks like most people, as I suspected, really don't think too much about evaluation when writing proposals, or at least for Perkins applications or maybe smaller amounts of money. Or it looks like 5% tended to be the next, 19% of you chose 5%, which is great. Certainly if you're setting aside 5% of a budget for a project for evaluation, you're on the right track. So keep that in mind as you move forward and looking at program implementation, that you really need to be sure that you're setting aside time and funds to do this work. Well, I want to give you a couple of hints about some assessment resources. First of all, there are 2 webinars that are really focused on evaluation that I encourage you, if you didn't participate in them, that you do go look at the archive versions. One of them has to do with assessing effectiveness. Do your program activities make a difference? It's sort of an overview of evaluation techniques. Gives some great examples of ways to do short-term outcome objective evaluations, certainly things about changing student attitudes and evaluating activities in the short term. And then the second one is building effective program assessments. That webinar is focused on a resource that we would encourage you, if you're looking at evaluation, to really take a look at. And it helps you use the tools that can be found at the Assessing Women and Men in Engineering program. And that website is named there on the slide. You can see it at www.aweonline.org. And certainly the archive versions of those 2 webinars can be found on our website. But let's just take a look at the AWE site so you can see what's there. Basically, this site is set up really for trying to do evaluation of program activities, primarily around recruitment and retention of students in engineering, science, and computer science programs. And you'll see just from looking at the homepage here that they have a variety of survey instruments for really taking a look at short-term objective evaluations. And they have a great data management tool that's also available, as well as this Applying Research to Practice library that will really give you some great hints about how to do evaluation. There, just to give you a sense, this is the screenshot of let's see, which one would I have chosen? I think this is probably the pre-college recruiting surveys. And so, yeah, the pre-college question module. And they have all these surveys, the pre-participation survey, immediate post-participation survey, and a 3 to 6 month post-participation survey. For high school, middle school, there's also college versions of this too, that's just further down the screen. And the surveys are set up such that you can put into them your own information. You can add questions. They're also, and they've all been tested, field tested, so that they are valid and reliable, like I mentioned in that slide earlier, an important thing when using survey instruments. So don't reinvent the wheel. Come here, take it, adapt it, and use it in your own circumstance. It's not important that you do that. All right, so that is basically step 4 of the 5-step process, pilot, test, and evaluate. We could talk about project logic modules and models and all kinds of things, but I think the most important thing about the whole evaluation process is that, one, you set measurable, well, SMART, I'll just say that. You all remember what SMART stands for, SMART objectives, and that you are careful about being realistic about what you can measure, and that you set up an evaluation process that actually measures those objectives that you've prepared for your program, and that you really do take a look at short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes and try to stay away, and I'm only saying this because it tends to be, in our world, we tend to sort of gravitate toward the process measures. Process measures are important because they'll determine whether or not you're implementing the program properly. But outcome measures are even more important. And so really focus on preparing yourself so that you develop outcome measures for your pilot test. I want to remind you about a couple of things that we have coming up. One is Just Works. It's a series, a webinar series being conducted by Dee Grayson on essential classroom instructional elements to improve student achievement in STEM. This webinar series is closed only to participants from the 7 participating states. And the 7 participating states, see how good my memory is here, is California, Oklahoma, Missouri, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota. If you're from any of those states, you can apply to participate in the webinar series. Just go to stemequitypipeline.org. The information about the application process is right on the home page. It'll take you to the information to participate in that. In order to participate in this series, you'll need to have either participated in the overview webinar that was held 2 weeks ago, or you have to view the archive version of it prior to applying to participate. But again, all that information is on our website, but I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of it. The second thing is we'll do the Step 5, implementing solutions in the 5-step program improvement process on Wednesday, March 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Mountain, noon Central, and 11 Pacific. I'll be working with you on that again, and that will complete the 5-step program series, which means that these will be available in archive versions on our website from now until eternity. Oh, dear me. Anyway, and you can access that there at any time. And certainly I would encourage you, if you're considering implementing this or even implementing a slice of it, that please feel free to share these with others and have folks that are being involved with your work take a look at them. Use them for training. All right, Q&A. So far, I think I answered Janet's question, unless she wants to ask me something else, and I don't see any other questions in the list. So unless someone pops up a question here in the next minute or so, I think we're ready to wrap it up. Again, let me just say that pilot testing is probably more relevant to larger institutional settings where you have multiple options to place an intervention, and you want to test it in one site first, or one location, or one program, or one classroom. Keep that in mind. But what's probably most important is how you evaluate the success of what you are implementing. Although when we do Step 5, we're going to talk about implementation strategies and how best to keep track of what you're doing around implementation issues, we will talk about evaluation, but not certainly to the degree we did here in this webinar. All right, we have a question. Is the 10% or greater for evaluation mandated in most or all NSF proposal submissions? No, it is not. It just sort of seems to be the industry standard. It is not always the case, so I'm not saying that you wouldn't find yourself in a situation where you would have a funder saying that they wanted a specific amount for evaluation. That is not uncommon. Just like often you'll see, especially in state grants, there's a limited percentage for administration. Sometimes funders also want to see a specific percentage for evaluation. In our case, it's something that we did as sort of an industry standard. That's what we see primarily out there. All right. Greg, I'll pass it back to you to do sort of the closing housekeeping items, and unless something else pops up while you're talking, I will be finished.
All right. Thank you for joining us today. Remember, this webinar will be available on the STEMequitypipeline.org website under the Professional Development heading, and then under Archived Webinars in the next few days. When you close your WebEx program, a few survey questions will open in your web browser that we would like for you to answer for us. Thank you for your time.